Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining today. I'm Rebecca. I lead product marketing here at Rallyware. I've had the chance to work really closely with Juan over the past year while we've been kind of developing this point of view on retail, what's broken, what's changing, what's actually kind of like driving performance in the store. And I would say what's been interesting about this is it really didn't start as a product conversation. It started as this pattern that we kept seeing across brands and retailers in our conversations and this consistent challenge that no one's really seemed to solve yet. So I guess, Juan, why don't we start there? So you can tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we can kind of jump into like from your perspective, what were you seeing in the market and in those conversations that really made you step back and say like something really isn't working with retail
Yeah,
sales development?
yeah, thanks for that, Rebecca. So, hi all. My name's Juan Molina. In terms of background, I think the important bits to share is I've been working with retailers since 2007, so almost 20 years when I started all the way back at Experian Marketing Services. And from all the way back then to even today, the consistent sort of thing that we've been hearing from retailers is that the holy grail is to be able to combine both store and what's happening digitally, because stores is really where 80% of the revenue comes in, but it's sort of the black box for most retailers. And so that was something that, frankly, I didn't know was solvable or something that we could sort of unlock until we were here. We got to Rallyware. And if I could take maybe 30 seconds to sort of tell an origin story, I was brought into the business last April. And our CEO had a very clear directive that he thought that training was broken. When you look at the retail store, we had been in market as a company called Miyagi for the last 10 years. We love that legacy. We had amazing customers, really, really good growth. But what George, our CEO, said is there's got to be a better way of bringing training into closer to where the transaction is happening, because training really only exists to sell stuff, right? But it's never available when someone's in front of you asking you a question or looking to buy something, right? And so it was really that simple. That was the challenge that was put before me, and we'll get into it a lot more. But that's really sort of the origin story of what we're going to talk about here.
Yeah. So I think what were kind of then, I guess, those things from the conversations you've had with however many brands and retailers over the past year that you kept hearing over and over. Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, good question. So I'll sort of answer that from both sides of the equation, right? What's interesting about retail is on top of 80% of all the money that brands and retailers make coming in through the store, the brands and retailers literally both win or lose at the same exact time, right? So they are fully and like in lockstep and aligned at trying to sort of win that moment. And so, from the brand side of things, the things that we continually kept hearing is, look, I'm spending a lot of time and energy and effort to try and train the associates at my dealers, whether they be the small mom and pop shops or the key accounts that we're working. But at the end of the day, we just don't see the engagement that we need. And it's really hard for us to measure the impact in terms of sell through, in terms of dollars of what we're doing. And lastly, we don't control the workforce, we don't control that environment. And so it gets really sticky to try and execute anything new or innovative, because you have to sort of go through that retailer. And what they're there to do is not necessarily just sell my brand only. They have lots of brands that they're trying to sell. So there was just sort of a lot of frustration with the traditional model from a brand perspective around how do they enable their retail network. And then when you think about the retailers, they had sort of different but similar scenarios, right? Which is, hey, the majority of my workforce is sort of made up of folks that are maybe taking shifts in between school, or they are retirees that are picking up shifts on the weekend. And yeah, the top 10% of my workforce are like the gurus. They're the experts. I don't care who you talk to. They don't need training. They're going to be always on point. But it's what do I do about the rest of that sales force that I have? Never mind around holiday seasons when I'm aggressively ramping up to add seasonal workers, right? And they are even a little less inclined to train or sort of do the things that I would want a full-time sort of employee to do. So that was there. They also started to talk a lot about, we have customers walking into our stores and they have AI feeding them real-time information about my products, my competitors' products, pricing, and my associate has less than that, right? And so those I would say were like the major sort of items from both the brand and the retailer that we were significantly hearing. Really, I mean, you can remember, Rebecca, we went on, I don't know, 30, 40 interviews with
Yeah.
brands, right? Where we were just sort of like, hey, we think we can do something better. Talk to us about what's happening. What don't you like? Where are you struggling? And we sort of heard the same thing over and over and over again, which I think you would agree was sort of a surprise
Yeah.
to us, right?
Yeah. I was surprised that like these aren't edge cases at all, right? Like this is just the day-to-day reality of pretty much every store team for every brand and retailer that we talk
Yeah.
to. So, I guess kind of like follow up to that is why do you think maybe these traditional approaches like in-store training programs or an LMS platform, like why do those fall short? Why aren't they solving this problem?
Yeah, so specifically with the field training, I think what happened with COVID, and we've heard this a lot from some of these big brands that had these large field teams that would go out and train you in person and really spend a lot of time, is COVID sort of those teams went away initially because of COVID, and then afterwards just because of budgetary constraints. And so those field teams don't really exist anymore. Maybe some brands do, but the majority of them that we talk to talk about how they've sort of spun that down. I have heard from a couple of larger brands that they're coming back with those programs and they're trying to introduce that back in. But the majority, like that's sort of one area around the field training. I think the field training also has its own issues where it's one moment in time, right? And the thing that we know about human beings is they forget 75% of everything they learn within 24 hours. So the field rep comes in, he does an amazing training, everybody's all jacked up about whatever the launch or the promo or the product is. And then it could be a day, a week, a month before a customer comes in and they need to access that information. And if it's, excuse me, if it's after 24 hours, they don't have that information available to them, right? So that's why I think the field sort of methodology, while I still think is very valuable, and I would expect that actually brands lean back into that. It's what is the system that you're architecting around those field operations and those training activities that then allow the training to sort of permeate beyond the 24-hour, evolutionary issue that we have as humans, where we just sort of forget. I think to the same about the same token, when you think about traditional LMS, which look, we were an LMS. We love that legacy. Like we were, we're one of the biggest fans when you think about that sort of piece as a component to an enablement strategy. But the reality is that all of the LMSs and inclusive of Miyagi, that was all happening off the floor, right? And so I think it runs into the same issues of it's not happening when I need it, when I need the information, right? I'm not in there watching a video because I'm working with the customer. I'm looking at the consumer, right? I'm not going to go look into a database to look at the video or to find the relevant content. And so it runs into the same exact issues, right? It's just happening off the floor, and then I'm assuming that I'm going to remember it, and that's just not what happens, right? I think traditionally, regardless of as we've done our investigation, regardless of what LMS or what methodology you're using, you barely get above 15% engagement, right? So you only get about 15% of your workforce to even go into the system, and that was a big pain point for both brands and retailers. Is no matter how hard they try, when they because it's voluntary training, it's just very difficult to get people to actually consume that information.
Yeah, I think I would also say like those systems are sort of designed for content delivery, right? Like they're not actually driving the behavior and they're certainly not unlocking that moment where the customer's in store.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, so like I mentioned, you've spent sort of a lot of time talking directly to retailers, to brands, and what were some of the moments or conversations that you can remember that like really validated this problem for you without naming names?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So look, one of the biggest light bulb moments that we had is I was on the phone with someone that I had done, business with at a long time ago, and they are now head of customer experience at 1,000 store retail chain. And as I was talking to him about what his problems were, he said something very specific. He was like, "Look, man, I get that everybody wants to do create this like crazy like journey, etc. But at the end of the day, what my associates need is they need to rock up to the store, they need to clock in, and then I want to tell them, hey, these are the top two or three things you need to think about today. Yeah, I have a whole database and a choose your own adventure flavor, and anybody that wants to go and look into that database, they can. But knowing what I know about my workforce, I don't care about that. I need a system that when my associates are in the store, I am personalizing and tailoring. Think of like an Instagram feed or a TikTok feed, where I just rock in, I look at the feed, and I am now optimizing the two or three things that they need to focus on for that day. So the example that he gave me was like, I'm an onboarding rep. As I think about the next day in the onboarding program, as opposed to being off the floor for 2 weeks or however long they might take that in a traditional onboarding, just spoon feed me, right? What's the next thing I need to think about? What's the next thing I need to think about? What is the next thing I need to be an expert on, etc. And so that was one of the big, big light bulb moments for me, where what it really sort of cemented is the star of the show is that associate, right? They need to be the protagonist in this entire sort of journey. And how are we making it easy for them? There's lots of technology to make life easy for consumers, to make life easy for the sort of the ecosystem of a retailer. There's not a hell of a lot that makes it easy for that associate. And again, if I go back to brands and retailers both win or lose in the same exact moment, the person that has the most control over what happens in that moment is that associate, right? And so I would say that that was light bulb moment number one is we need to tailor and really architect anything that we're talking about here around that associate, right? So that's number one. I think number two, the next sort of light bulb moment that I had is the appetite for change and innovation at both the brand and the retailer. I thought that we were going to be introducing something that was going to be a little bit ahead of its time and was going to take us a while to sort of educate folks and get to a point where we hit a critical mass of enough momentum in the market for this to really take off. And I think you would agree, it's like 1,000% hit rate, right? Where everybody that we've talked to agrees that they have the issue, and everybody that we talk to about how we're thinking about shifting everything over into real time and into the store when consumers, products, and the associate is interacting, everybody is ready to go there, right? Whether it be old traditional brands that are, notoriously hard to move and never want to be the first mover, to really innovative upstart brands that are sort of growing like weeds and they need to sort of scale a lot quicker. Everybody conceptually agrees that it's time for a change. And so that was sort of the second light bulb moment that we weren't going to have to wait as long as I've needed to wait in my career traditionally when we're launching a new product.
And do you
Um,
think that's just because of like the prevalence of AI and not wanting to get left behind, or why do you think that is?
no, I think it's because of the acute pain of not knowing what is happening with your sales
Mhm.
until 2 or 3 or 4 weeks after the
Yeah.
fact. And that means you can't do anything about it, right? So brands sort of feel like very handcuffed, if you will, that it's very difficult in flight to actually try and understand what's happening and then most importantly, do something about it. And I think on the retailer side, you know, they have an acute pain of knowing that 70%, somewhere between 50 to 70% of everybody that walks into their store walks out without buying something. And
Hmm.
in 2026, right? Like, I don't think people get up, get dressed, get in their car, and go to a store unless they have real intent to buy something, right? It's not like when I was a kid where you go to the mall to meet up with your friends, right? That was like a social gathering place, and lots of people would go to the mall and not have any intent to buy anything. I just don't really think that that's the way the consumer is behaving right now. And so those retailers have foot counter technology. They know exactly how many people walk in and exactly how many people walk out without buying anything. And taking that from 50 to 70% to 48 or 68% or 63%, like small incremental improvements on that conversion mean lots and lots of incremental sell through for those retailers. So, I always like to think that it's our idea and that, we were the ones that were the catalyst for it. No, It really comes down to a lack of visibility and control on the brand side and a lack of understanding how to optimize conversion on the retailer side, where, again, they've got a lot of people that walk in ultimately with intent and walk out without buying anything, and that must change.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. Um, so I guess you kind of already answered this, but like at what point do you think it really clicked? Like this isn't a training problem at all? Because I think we leaned into like thinking it was more of a training problem in the beginning, but it
Yeah.
turns out like it's sort of a new, different category of problem.
Yeah, I would say this really started to cement itself in December of last year. So we went to the running event in San Antonio. We had a ton of customers that were there, but that in that sort of 3 day time span, we were able to have, I think it was like 80 meetings, and it was sort of 50% brands, 50% retailers,
I think
and
interestingly too, like store staff and people who work at like the head office.
exactly.
So yeah,
Yeah, lots of the folks in the sort of chain of events that happen for a product to get sold on a store floor. And what really sort of opened our eyes is we brought sort of a prototype, and we're not going to talk about that here, but because that's not the purpose. But we brought a prototype of what the idea was that we had to solve this. And I'm not trying to be sort of boisterous here. Jaws dropped. Jaws, I mean, you were there, right?
yeah.
You saw that movie. Like, it was just incredible to see people be like, wait a second. And then they would go and grab somebody. Hey, come here. You got to look at this. And then they would go grab someone else. And even like a lot of the sort of the work that we're doing now and stuff that's happening in 2026, it all originated at that event. And so it was really, really eye-opening. And then from there we went to NRF. And at NRF, it was all about talking to the retail ecosystem, right? Because one of the things that we also believe is that this isn't a scenario where we're gonna, one company can solve this. That's not the way it works, right? If you think about the retailer technology stack, it's chock full of stuff and it's really hard to get into that environment for good reason, right? Like retailers have a million companies trying to get them to implement stuff, but they have a limited budget, a limited amount of time with their IT team, and they need to be incredibly ruthless with how they prioritize who and what they work with. So at NRF, our stated goal was really just to understand of the retail ecosystem, things like point of sale, workforce management, inventory management, task management, right? Those kinds of companies. We had 19 meetings with potential partners, I would say. And the other eye-opening scenario there is there was a hole, if you will, in the solutions that these partners are offering to their retail clients, that could potentially be filled by some of the concepts that we're cooking up. And so that was another sort of big sort of step forward. And then lastly, we just got back from Shop Talk in Las Vegas. That was at the end of March. And there, I would say that was sort of the final moment where it was just, it sort of took on a life of its own in terms of what we're talking about, because we booked very strategic meetings there, like really strategic meetings, right? And the folks that we talked to, the brands that we talked to, the retailers that we talked to. Um, it was very quick, right? We did like a speed dating thing. So we had less than 15 minutes with every executive that we met with. And in 15 minutes, we were able to explain our short, medium, and long-term vision, show them a very quick example of what a day in the life of working with us would look like. And all of them were like, yep, we're going to continue this conversation. And we've got a lot of those conversations that are heating up right now. So I would say that those were the milestones, if I can sort of, think back that really sort of at each sort of gate, we were like, oh my Lord, here we go.
Yeah. And I think it's sort of like we need to shift from maybe like traditional like training to remember because we know that that doesn't work, right? To like actually training people in the moment to sell and like what to do next.
Yeah.
But maybe talk to me a bit about like what does that actually mean in practice? Like let's talk about like kind of that paradigm shift I think that needs to happen.
Yeah, that's a really good point, right? And I think that I've sort of already talked about shifting away from off the floor, right? And just doing, like you said, like in the moment, right? You only need the training information available. if someone's in your store asking about that product. Otherwise, it's not that it's not valuable, but it's just not valuable to that retailer, right? Because if no one's asking about that product, there's no need to get my associate or waste my associate's time with it. But once we start to unlock what we are terming the moment of decision, which is where there's a moment in time where there's an associate, a brand product, and a consumer overlapping in the aisle in the store in real time, now we can start to shift away from I'm training you to remember something to I'm just training you to use these tools to unlock that moment. But at the same time, if you're able to do that, now we can start to think about incremental revenue, right? It's sort of not different than ecom, right? On ecom, everything's sort of very buttoned up, where they know that if you're on my site and you put product A in the cart, and then I offer you product B, X% of the time you're going to convert, and that means X more money to me as the brand or the retailer. That's a very similar concept that now if we're unlocking that moment in time where if I know what product you're asking me about, I should be able to then tell that associate, these are the additional sort of items that you want to add to the basket. Or about 10% of the time, people are going to walk in and you're not going to have that product in the spec, the size, or the fit that they want. And so why not provide an out of stock substitution? Offer or potentially place an order right from the aisle to your e-commerce because lots of retailers do that today, right? They'll if I don't have it in the store, I'll place it to the website, but there's no need to like, oh, come back with me to the register and let's go on the website and let me place the order. Like, well, why do that, right? Like, I know what you're looking at. This is what you wanted. Click a button, place the order, off you go. And then I think beyond that, that moment opens up the ability to transition. And maybe this is what the question that you were really asking transition to a more modern sort of, I'll say training. We don't think that we're a training company anymore. We think we're a sales execution company, but open that moment to in the flow learning, right? Because now when I understand how you're consuming the stuff in the LMS and how you're engaging with products and consumers in the aisle, I can start to really tailor coaching, right? So we want to move away from learning and talk about more sales coaching for these associates, and we can start to really optimize and tailor it on a one-to-one basis because maybe we're in a single store, you rock at selling sneakers, but we also sell golf clubs. You don't know anything about golf. What if someone comes in and asks you, I'm going to lose that sale now because you don't know anything about golf? No. Through technology, I can enable you to go ahead and make that sale regardless, right? And I think lastly, some of the data that we're going to be able that you can start unlocking in that moment could be very, very valuable, both in the short term when you think about brands understanding what's actually happening as they launch their product, where today they have to wait a few weeks to figure that out, to retailers knowing how to potentially optimize their marketing and advertising spend, to then over the long term, when you think about the AI enabled store of the future, you're going to need this kind of data, right? You're going to need this kind of data to really move into whatever that world looks like.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that element of kind of like future proofing. I think it really does unlock that as well. And I do also think like this moment of decision is probably one of the most important ideas that we've kind of come up with. Um, why do you think most systems today kind of like miss that moment, right? Like
Yeah.
what's that missing piece?
Yeah, it's interesting that you asked that question, right? I think Google coined the term the zero moment of truth,
Yeah.
right? And I think what we maybe have stumbled upon or uncovered is that for the first time, retailers and brands can bring that similar concept of the zero moment of truth into the aisle, right? And when we talk about our concepts and when we talk about our ideas, the reaction we get quite a bit, and you've been on a lot of these meetings, is I can't believe no one's thinking about this yet.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? And so look, there's nothing crazy I don't think about this. I just don't think people thought it was possible. And maybe we were just crazy enough to try.
Yeah, a year ago we just
Yep,
stumbled into this. Yeah.
absolutely.
Um,
Absolutely.
so I guess you've kind of touched on this a bit also, but like if a retailer or brand actually gets this right, like they're starting to enable associates like in this moment of decision, what do you think kind of changes first from a business perspective? Like what's the impact that we could see?
Yeah, good question. So as we think about our sort of financial model, one of the things that we wanted to stay away from was the we're going to bring you a 500%
Yeah.
ROI or 1,000% ROI. Like that's really hard to quantify, and as sort of a commercial person. I don't like those. I don't like that, right? Because it's just difficult. Like, help me out here, man. What does that mean for me? 1,000%
Exactly.
ROI, right? So, the way that we think about it is we think we can help sell 1 to 2 incremental units per store per month. That's the way we think about it, right? And now, if you think about the way these stores are run, where they basically have their own P&L, you can start to very quickly justify the investment of moving into the aisle of architecting these systems that we're talking about because the sell-through pays for it and then some, right? The blessing and the curse of retail is you take $1 and if you've got 1,000 stores, it's actually multiplied over a thousand stores, right? So if I'm spending $1, it's not $1, it's 1,000. But if I'm making $1, it's not $1, it's 1,000, right? And so what we really try and pride ourselves on is making this incredibly easy to consume from an ROI perspective and understanding that if you can help sell, even if it's 1 unit a week, right? Even that is very reasonable. Now you're talking about 4 units a month times whatever the average sale price is, and very quickly you can start to annualize a very real incremental sell-through return.
hmm And I don't know if you have anything else to add around this, but I think we've kind of seen we can make this shift for some of these teams that have maybe traditionally been looked at as a cost center and those systems, and it starts turning it into like an actual revenue channel.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, one example that I'll give you is I think most retailers today understand that they need devices in the aisle, right? That they want sort of the Apple Store experience, right? Which I love that experience, right? You walk in, you go straight to the product. They come over to you. Any information that you need, they have at their fingertips. You can pay them right in the aisle. Someone walks out, hands you your bag, off you go, right? And the issue with that is if you don't have the pockets, right, then it gets very difficult because devices are incredibly expensive. Sometimes devices break, sometimes devices don't, right? And so it's sort of its own beast. And today, retailers really only look at those as cost centers. And I
Mhm.
think to your point, tomorrow, if you can turn each one of those devices into a revenue driver that justifies its own cost, right? Now, all of a sudden, you can see a world where it makes sense for me to put a device in the hands of every associate that's on shift. And when you hit that world, now that sort of white glove, much more elevated retail experience becomes available
Mhm.
to retailers that maybe previously wouldn't have had that open to them.
Yeah, yeah. And then I guess if we kind of like zoom out for a second here, as we're looking ahead into, we've already, heard they're starting to allocate 2027 budgets, things like that. What should retail leaders and brand leaders be thinking about right now if they want to stay competitive over the next few years?
Yeah, I would say that the number one risk that I think I'm hearing is folks are especially folks that are making this kind of investment for the first time, right? So I've talked to a number of retailers recently that are starting to scale up their store count, and so that means they need something, right? Before it was easy. We had one trainer, he'd go to all the stores, we were in front of everybody, no
Well, sometimes it's
problem.
international too, right? Like they're opening new stores in different countries.
Bingo. So that's a huge one. We've also talked to a number of brands that are spinning up their own retail
Yeah.
footprint. And so there are folks that haven't sort of thought about how am I going to enable these sales associates. And the number one mistake, it's sort of maybe that's too aggressive to say, but the number one concern I would have is that you're gonna spend money in 2026 and spend IT time and budget, which is like a very, very valuable for all of these retailers, on implementing a system of yesterday, right? And so that is the sort of the thing that I would challenge anybody on is if you're thinking about making investments and enabling, and you're thinking about making investments in how you get your associates to be better sellers, you need to think about this a lot differently. Never mind that AI sort of enabled store of the future, right? So it's one thing to impact sell through and change behaviors, sure, and you should definitely think about how you do that in the forward-looking sense, not necessarily in the backward-looking sense. And I hope I'm not being too negative about that. Again, our legacy is as an LMS. We love that technology. Like that's not what I'm saying. But things change. The world evolves, and I think you need to evolve with it. And then beyond that, that AI sort of store of the future. I really do not see a world where you as a brand or retailer can move into that world unless you're capturing real-time signals from the aisle.
Yeah, yeah, makes sense. Um, well, also this was great. I think one of the biggest takeaways for me is that like this isn't, and this is kind of from our year-long journey, like it's not about more training, it's not about more content or even more tools, right? Like it's about really helping associates take that right action at the right time, right in that moment of decision that actually drives revenue. So I don't know if you have any final final thoughts before we wrap up.
No, I would just think that you know, I hope that this is helpful for folks to realize that something that maybe, and especially folks that have been in retail for a long time, who had been sold the promise of 360-degree view of the
Yeah.
customer and omni-channel and all this stuff, right? It always broke down when you got to the store, which is where the majority of my money comes in. Hopefully, this helps them see that there's a world where it is actually realistic now that you can start to really create a sort of a connected view of what's happening both in digital channels and in store. And now think about being able to combine all of that into the stuff that these retailers have, like machine learning and AI and all of this other stuff that they're making decisions and investments on.
hmm Well, thank you for walking us through this, and thanks everyone for watching.
Cool. Thanks.